A super special thank you to everybody who is also joining us from Malawi this evening, as I know it's around 9 p.m. for you guys, so we really appreciate you being here. Although it is the Leaders Network's first event, this event is 2050's third and final event in our digital series about climate justice for a positive future. This event will be focusing on personal journeys throughout lockdown and the effects this has had on our young leaders. Although we have been faced with challenges, we want to also look at what opportunities have arisen from these challenges. We look to the future and what our young leaders have learned to take forward in a fight to obtain climate justice. For those of you who are joining this evening's event as newbies to 2050, I'll explain a little bit about who we are and what we do. 2050 Climate Group is a volunteer-led youth climate charity, empowering, equipping and enabling young people in Scotland with the skills and confidence that they need to take climate action, whether it be in their personal, professional or political lives. Each year, we welcome 130 young leaders from across Scotland to take part in our flagship Young Leaders Development Programme. This year is a bit different for so many reasons, but one of the positive things is that by taking our events online, we can open them up to the public, and we are so excited to have people joining from all over the world today. 2050 Climate Group is a charity, and everybody here today who has been working behind the scenes to make this event possible, with the exception of our lovely Eve and Joe, are volunteers. Additionally, before we start, I'll attempt to tackle the definition of climate justice. This has different meanings to different people, and this definition is by no means binary. Climate justice, as described by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is justice that links development and human rights to achieve a human-centred approach to addressing climate change, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable people and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its impacts equitably and fairly. Keep this in mind as we hear from our speakers later on this evening. Now on to the order of the evening and our wonderful speakers. So we have Alex, Joanne and Jonathan with us this evening, who will all speak for 15 minutes about their experiences over lockdown and where they are now. After that, we will have a 15-minute question and answer session. If at any point during the event you wish to ask a question, please try to keep this for the question and answer session at the end. To ask a question during the question and answer session, please type "ask" in capital letters into the chat box and we will come back to you in the question and answer session. If you don't want to have your video and mic on, that's absolutely fine. Just please type your question into the chat box and one of our volunteers will read it out to the speakers during the session. There will also be our volunteers on hand over our social media platforms should you wish to ask anything over social media. If you are having technical difficulties at any point, we have technical support on Zoom as well, and they can be contacted through our social media channels or email, which is contact@2050.scot, or via the Zoom chat as well. Now moving on to our lovely speakers of the evening. We have Alex, who graduated with an honours degree in sustainable development in 2010. Having worked in a variety of roles within environmental and sustainability themes, she completed the YLDP, which is the Young Leader Development Programme, this year and is passionate about youth voice and advocacy. She is currently leading on the YPI programme in Scotland, which gives young people in 250 secondary schools a platform to advocate for social issues and charities in their local communities. I'm sure we'll all give her a warm welcome in tonight's event, and I'm super excited to chat with you in a few moments. Joanne is one of the youth leaders from Malawi Scotland Partnership Climate Change Youth Leaders Project. She is a student pursuing a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences. Joanne is the co-founder of Awawo, an eco-friendly startup producing products from bamboo. She's passionate about youth and women's inclusion in climate action. I cannot wait to hear the different challenges and opportunities that you've had throughout your time, Joanne, and I'm excited to speak to you just after we have a chat with Alex first. And finally, but definitely last but not least, Jonathan is a Climate Exchange Research Fellow, currently working with the University of Strathclyde and the Scottish Government to support evidence-based policy making around heat decarbonisation and energy networks. I've had the pleasure of seeing Jonathan at many of our events before, and his input is always extremely valued. So I can't wait to chat to you this evening too. We will kick off this evening by running through some questions with Alex and her experience. Is that you on off mute now? If you want to give everyone a wee wave.
Hey everyone.
Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And I suppose it's best to just kick off and start with the questions, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
So first question would be, just can you tell us a wee bit about yourself and where you were in your life when lockdown started and what you can remember about the announcement when it came out about lockdown?
So I think this has, in preparing for tonight, has been a really interesting process. It's definitely allowed me to reflect on kind of a lot of the feelings that I had at the start of everything back in March and kind of where I've reached now. So thank you very much for that opportunity, and thanks for inviting me to kind of share my journey. I'd probably caveat that just by saying it's my journey, it's a personal journey. Everyone on the call will have had their own experiences and their own journeys, and I'm hoping that we can explore some of that in the Q&A later. In terms of me, you heard my introduction from Jen. I'm really proud to be the National Coordinator for the Youth and Philanthropy Initiative. I'm based in Aberdeen. I live in a flat on my own in Aberdeen. That becomes important later. And I work sort of exclusively with schools. School engagement is the core of my role. So I guess in terms of the initial feelings that I had around lockdown and the concept of lockdown, there were a few themes in there. Anxiety, a sense of trepidation I hadn't felt before, sadness, a lot of disbelief, even though a few people in my life had been trying to prepare me for the idea of a lockdown for quite a while. I don't know if anyone else felt the same, but I certainly maybe didn't quite believe that it would actually happen, if I'm brutally honest. And I certainly didn't believe that we would still be sitting here in November in a sort of semi-similar situation. I felt quite overwhelmed. And I think a real particular moment of memory that I have around the announcement in particular was sitting on my own in my flat watching the announcement on TV and just being intensely relieved that we could leave the house for an hour per day for exercise and to get outside. And that's probably just a reflection on the privilege that I have of having a fantastic place to live, but no garden and no outdoor space. And the final kind of feeling that I had was just prior to the end of lockdown announcement, schools were closing. And given that my job is entirely contingent on school engagement, I didn't really know at that point what that meant for my role and my security in myself. One other reflection is just, it's probably a bit of a guilty reflection, but it's a very honest one. And I wanted to approach this as honestly as I could. I feel guilty about the fact that I actually was looking forward to a much slower pace of life. Where I was at the time, it was an incredibly busy time in my life, holding down a long distance relationship and a very, very busy job with lots of travel. And there was a guilty part of me that thought, actually, this is an opportunity to press pause and stay at home for a while. And whilst being really overwhelmed by everything else, I appreciated that opportunity. So that's a little bit about me and how I felt and where I was at. And I'll kind of come on to talk a bit more in answer to a few of your other questions, but I guess some of the feelings that I had were quite related to often how I feel about the climate change agenda. So being overwhelmed, maybe feeling a bit powerless, out of control, feeling sadness, anger, disbelief at various elements of kind of that personal interest I have in the climate change agenda and sustainability and environmental issues. So there's definitely a similarity there for sure.
Of course, no, there's so much of that rings true to myself as well, especially the slower pace of life, feeling quite guilty that you're almost looking forward to that. And was there anything in your life in particular that was going to dramatically change?
Absolutely. So from a personal perspective, I mentioned that I'm in a long distance relationship. My partner lives in Edinburgh. So from a personal perspective, there is a significant change there. I wasn't going to see him for a while. It turned out to be 3 months in the end that we weren't able to see each other for. I know that lots of people will have been in a similar position, and just feel incredibly lucky to have had FaceTime and video calls to keep in touch. But that was certainly a difficult element from a personal perspective. Working from home was a big transition. Was incredibly lucky to have job security, it transpired, and we've done a huge amount of really fantastic work throughout lockdown, which I'm really proud of the team for. But my job has become a desk job, and normally I would be traveling all around Scotland each and every week. So that was a massive change in terms of not being out and about, speaking to people and interacting, and not traveling in nearly the manner, or not at all traveling, in comparison to what I was before. So those were a couple of kind of the key changes. And I suppose linking that to my environmental, suddenly it was so much less than it was before. And I know we're going to come on to talk a little bit more about that, but that was probably another significant change. My carbon footprint and my environmental impact had sort of decreased drastically, and I'm sure many of us would have found the same.
Definitely, of course. And so if you were to say the sort of main challenges that arose from you over that period of time, sort of whether it's personal, work, or environmentally, what would you say that the main challenges were?
I think a significant challenge from my perspective was being quite isolated and being quite a sociable person, and being and feeling in a sense quite isolated, but at the same time strangely well connected with people at the same time. I don't know if that makes very much sense, or if anyone can empathize with that feeling, but I think throughout the course of this, I've certainly grown closer and developed relationships with some of the key people in my life, work colleagues in particular. But equally, at the same time, there's been a lot of time sort of spent solo, which is a really interesting challenge that has presented opportunities as well. And I'll kind of come on to chat a little bit about those. I think a key challenge of this whole situation has been, I guess, confronting your own kind of physical and mental health, and being quite honest about that and the challenges around it. They've definitely been significant. This has been a roller coaster for all of us. And that's definitely something that has been a challenge at times. From an environmental perspective, I think the challenges have probably been more like opportunities. And that's been the opportunity to have a slower pace of life, get out and enjoy nature. This might sound really strange, but in giving just an hour a day outside, it's amazing how much more tuned in you become to nature and what's around you, and how much you appreciate your local surroundings. And I suppose before this, I'd always thought of myself as someone who did appreciate that, who did get out into the local area, who did explore. And the truth is, lockdown and the subsequent period has definitely sharpened that. So that appreciation for nature and what we're, I guess, put bluntly, trying to save with a lot of our actions, that was a challenge in terms of reconciling where we're at with the environmental agenda versus where we could be, but also an opportunity to actually refocus on those objectives. So those are a couple of challenges and a couple of opportunities.
Of course. And in particular, would you say that there was an environmental impact attached to those challenges as well? I suppose positive or negative environmental impact of the challenges?
I think if you link one of the challenges being, and also an opportunity, working from home, I think the environmental impact of that was positive, because, as I said, I would normally travel all around the country each week, often granted by public transport, but still traveling. I also had sort of reasons in my personal life to travel between two cities in Scotland. So the environmental impact overall of lockdown for me, from a personal perspective, was positive, and something that I sort of enjoyed looking or seeing in the early part of lockdown was how almost the earth seemed to bounce back a little bit, with everyone staying at home, with such a significant reduction in environmental impacts. It was kind of amazing to see some of the stories that came out, but equally that came at a great cost around our civil liberties, around our mental health, around people's physical health. in terms of the impact of the pandemic and so on. So it was a real double-edged sword in that sense. I could certainly see the environmental advantages of the situation that we were in, but it wasn't as simple as being kind of pleased about those. It was definitely a double-edged sword and a kind of a real challenge to navigate your thoughts and reconcile thoughts on that. And I'll come on in a minute to talk about the kind of the pivots that we made as a society in order to create change, because I think that's been something that's been really key that's come out. At this point, I might just quickly share in terms of emotions and journey and challenges. I wonder if I could just quickly share a slide.
Of course.
I'm just going to try and do this. So this is a slide that hopefully you can see that. Okay. And this is a slide called, and it's the Kubler-Ross curve. I'm not going to enlarge it, but hopefully you can see it okay there. This is I've linked, I'll put out the links afterwards in terms of where this has come from and a little bit more reading if anyone's interested. But this is a slide that was shared at one of our team meetings in early May, so the 4th of May, so about 6 weeks into lockdown. And it's actually a grief curve, but has then been sort of utilised in a lot of change management theory since then. And it talks about the different stages of grief. And I would say this is quite representative of my journey through COVID. And perhaps some of you will see elements of it within your own journeys as well. And something that really struck me during that session that we had was we got asked to sort of talk about which stage we felt like we were at on the curve at that point. And something that's really stuck with me is that one of my colleagues said, I think I'm going back and forth on that curve all the time. I can see aspects and elements of where I've been and where I'm going on that curve. And that's always stuck with me because I think throughout this whole process, through all the challenges, environmental, work, personal, I think really going back and forth on that curve has been synonymous with the whole journey. So I'm kind of more than happy to share that as a link afterwards, but that was something that I felt helped me better articulate and navigate through the whole process in terms of all the challenges and so on as well.
100%. I know, I think everybody's had that horrible journey of up and down and roundabout and not really knowing whether you've got 2 feet in the air or 2 feet in the ground. And how would you say, how did you cope with these sorts of challenges? Did you adopt any new approaches to the situations, or, you know, anything that comments that you would have on that?
I think the key element of all of this really has been how to maintain self-motivation. And if I reflect on my sort of experience through the Young Leaders Development Programme, you mentioned in my introduction, Jen, that I completed the 2050 Young Leaders Development Programme, the most recent one. There was a lot of reflection on your role as a leader in the climate change debate and in your own workplace and in your own personal life and so on. And I think one of the most significant challenges has been around self-motivation, and I've had to adopt some changes to be able to navigate that. I think many people probably have. Like many, if I'm honest, I started lockdown with great gusto, with a new fitness regime, with a better diet, with all sorts of great habits that some have persisted and some, I'll be brutally honest, have fallen by the wayside at times and then come back and forth. But I think that sort of change in routine and making sure that exercise was a core component, as I said, getting out into nature, appreciating the environment around you was a really key element of something that was really important to me. I think being kind of slightly separated from your support network and being cut off from elements of that and the associated kind of fear of unknown and the lack of control of personal circumstances meant that you had to kind of almost, or I had to sort of go inside myself a little bit and find a level of maybe dedication that I didn't think that I maybe had at times. I had a lot of time to think, and so a lot of my adaptations were around kind of mindfulness, exercise, yoga, stretching, good sleep habits, and also refocusing on what was important. And a lot of the kind of resulting actions that I've got around the Climate 2050 group, volunteering, other activities that I've gotten involved in since are around kind of refocusing my priorities and refocusing my kind of life goals. And I think in order to be an effective leader, it takes that self-reflection and that time to work out what it is that's important to you. And sometimes the busyness of life doesn't allow for that. So a lot of what I applied in terms of changes was just spending a little bit more time on me and working out exactly what I needed to do to be effective as a leader. And if I really truly want to be as heavily involved in the climate change agenda as I think I do, how can I best do that? And what are the best habits for me to have as an individual to be able to be the most effective leader that I can be?
I know I echo your getting into a good sleep regime. I don't think I've ever slept so much in my life. I feel totally new after lockdown. And were there any particular opportunities that arose for you during the lockdown period?
I think just that opportunity to slow everything down. And I realize that I say this from, I'm very conscious of kind of pointing out that I say this from a position of incredible privilege. I think lockdown has been, and this whole journey has been so different for each and every one of us. And it's been certain things that I've been able to implement in my life, things like shopping locally and more sustainably, more seasonally, being able to visit zero waste shops, being able to travel less, not having to travel to work, being able to work from home. A lot of it has really sharpened my view on my sense of privilege and how lucky I am to have the life that I lead. And so a lot of that in terms of opportunity has come to me realizing that actually I want to be able to use that in the best way. Organizationally and work-wise, I think there's been a phenomenal opportunity afforded to us from a work perspective. I was a real advocate prior to lockdown of more flexible working, more remote working. We had an element of that in what we did anyway, because often we were out and about and traveling and things. But my organization is a fantastic organization, and there's a real emphasis on being face-to-face and being part of the team. And so that was a preference. And now we've been able to probably engage as well, if not better, with all of our partners during the course of lockdown and working remotely. We've been able to accommodate virtual study visits to Nashville instead of sending 15 teachers to fly over there for 5 days. Some of the things that we've been able to do as an organisation and be able to sort of demonstrate and prove have been really fantastic, and they're going to have some really long-lasting impacts on the way that we work as an organisation. So I think that's been a really key opportunity.
Great, perfect. And I suppose the final question would be, what change in your day-to-day life would you say that you would take forward past lockdown and COVID to help society take an intersectional approach to a green recovery?
Intersectionality is a really interesting word, and we've talked a lot about it through this digital series. I think key elements for me in terms of taking it forward are standing up for what you believe in and trying to get past imposter syndrome. The debate around climate change, environmental issues, climate justice, intersectionality is such a huge complex debate that not one of us is ever going to be able to fully master all of those arguments and all of the understanding that goes with such a complex debate. And I think sometimes that might leave people feeling a little bit powerless and a little bit scared to speak up. So a key element that I am taking forward is that I think people would probably reflect on me being quite a confident person in general, but actually there's a real lack of confidence sometimes that sits behind that, and that's something that really I've committed to trying to tackle and head on, be very open about, be very transparent about, and share that with people around me, and in terms of that journey, that personal journey, because I think often the best answers come from within yourself, and that's something that's really, really important. But I think using my platform, using my voice, and being collaborative and working with great people like you in the 2050 network, looking at opportunities out with. And another key thing as well is really just being able to influence people around me in a more confident way, in a gentle way, not always in a big stick kind of way, but maybe more of a carrot kind of a way. But that general influencing piece is something that I feel a lot more confident about. And really just continuing to to recognize how lucky I've been throughout this whole experience, to have job security, to have a support network, and to try and continue to support the young people that we work with to speak up about social issues that they're passionate about, because it's more important than ever that they're continuing to support the third sector in the programme that we run. So yeah, committing to that and continuing that agenda is going to be really important for me moving forward.
Great, I know. Well, just before we go and we move on to the next speaker, Joanne, I'm just thinking, is there any sort of final thoughts that you have? We'll obviously come back in the question and answer session to you, Alex, but just any sort of final thoughts before then?
Yeah, absolutely. Just very quickly, I'd say that I guess maybe just as a question for the Q&A and for people to think about, or was on a couple of fronts. One is around the kind of the promised green recovery that was spoken about so much early doors and lockdown. And we heard so much about the opportunity and the potential for a green recovery and how great that was going to be. I haven't seen that in practice, and I'd be really interested to get people's thoughts on whether they feel like that's a core component of our recovery from the COVID pandemic. And also I've been really interested in the level of change that we've managed to generate as a society, how quickly we've been able to pivot, how quickly things have happened in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of policy, bureaucracy, etc. But a lot of that has required a real restriction on our civil liberties. It's forced a level of change that has resulted in significant environmental benefit. And I'd be really interested in people's thoughts around whether this is the type and level of compromise that we, and I mean we in the widest possible sense, need to be willing to concede to in order to meet our climate change targets. So those are a couple of kind of final thoughts from me.
Great, well, thank you so much. And I'm clapping for everybody on the call. And yeah, we will hear from you in not the too distant future about the sort of in the Q&A session. Can we have Joanne? Can you unmute yourself? Is that okay?
Yes, I can. I'm here now.
Hello, welcome. I'm sorry I never got to catch you before we came on to the big group discussion, but it's very grateful that you're here this evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I suppose just to kick off, can you tell us a wee bit about yourself and where you were in your life when lockdown started, and just what you thought about sort of the announcements that were going on at the time and everything?
Okay, first of all, I must start by saying a big thank you. I'm actually very overwhelmed to be part of this awesome program tonight. So my name is Joanne Chigwenembe. I am basically a student at the Longo University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. I am pursuing my bachelor's degree in environmental sciences. I am also one of the climate change youth leaders for the Malawi Scotland Partnership Project. I am also like a co-founder of a startup, an eco-friendly startup. We call it Awawo. So basically what we do is we're making stuff from bamboo because we're more aware about how sustainable bamboo is as compared to many other products. So we're kind of leveraging for that kind of thing. When the lockdown message came, I think I was at school by then. It was around the 27th of March. But the tricky thing is the lockdown situation here was maybe not as it was that side, because ours was a little more flexible. But basically what we had were schools closing, and then we had like public gatherings having to be limited to a few people, that kind of thing, which is actually very difficult considering that in our culture, meeting with people is actually part of the thing. So yeah, that was basically it. And initially, I didn't think it would be that serious because, okay, by the time the message was being announced, we only had at least 3 cases, and people were actually debating about the truth of the situation and how intense it can be. And there was like so much going on. And then eventually we started seeing like the cases rising and all that. So there was like that initial fear that came with it. I think I've actually gone into the second question, but yeah.
That's fine. Yeah, it was just, yeah, what were your initial fears and thoughts when lockdown started? And was there anything sort of within your life that was going to have to dramatically change?
Well, I think my life had to slow down dramatically because on the other hand, I am managing the startup. It's kind of like quite demanding. and also my school. And then there's like so many other commitments that I had. So I had to see myself slow down from all of this to like a standstill. So basically, on this end, the virtual kind of situation, virtual learning and all that was not really possible. So trying to figure things out was, yeah, I think it actually took a lot of adjusting to get used to. I finally had so much time, which I never really had. In the first days, it kind of left me feeling empty because I felt there's nothing I'm doing. I'm used to always being on the go. And on the other hand, like for the startup, that meant probably there were not really as many sales as we expected and not really as many conferences as we had. We had a couple of bamboo festivals going on and stuff, but we were not able to actually go through with all that. So that kind of was a little disappointing, but eventually we began to adjust that, well, this is currently where things are. And yeah.
Of course. And so for you then, what would you say were the main challenges that arose over the period of lockdown, whether it's sort of work, personal, or, you know, environmental challenges that you found?
Personally, I felt having to just come to a halt was really something very big for me. And on the other hand, most of my family, like my family stays in Tanzania. So basically I wasn't able to meet them until now. So it was one of those things that was kind of very difficult. And on the other hand, I was supposed to be graduating, I think this coming week. But then since we couldn't have a virtual semester and all that, what it meant was I just had to stay at home. And then on the other hand, for the startup, things kind of slowed down quite a lot. And we actually had like very ambitious targets and all that going on. So all that for me was quite challenging. But going to the environmental challenges, I know Alex talked about the opportunities that came with it. But for us, the major thing that I saw was a waste management problem. Because here people were not necessarily in their homes. People were actually given the freedom to go to town, go shopping and do all that kind of stuff. People were able to congregate in churches. People were able to have meetings and weddings and all that kind of stuff. But now that was done under strict COVID restrictions. One of them being the need for for masks. And generally, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the masks that were already available were the single-use masks. So we already have a waste management challenge, but I felt it became quite worse with the coming of the pandemic. And then we actually now had a lot of that stuff going on. You would actually find a lot of used masks just lying around and that kind of thing. And so it compounding with the already existing problem, I just felt it was quite big because inevitably we would find our waste in like places like rivers and all that. And being a nation that depends significantly on such water sources, surface water sources, I actually found that to be something that is quite a challenge. And up until now, we probably haven't resolved it. But towards like the most recent months, people have now been advocating for the reusable masks and all that. So I felt that in a way kind of toned things down a little bit. But yeah, for me, I think that was one of the major challenges. And then also for, let's talk of eco-friendly startups or eco-friendly ventures generally. What that meant for us was, well, we're not making sales, and definitely the causes that we're standing for, it wasn't really easy for us to fund in that sense. And generally, I think for most of the young leaders in the Malawi-Scotland Partnership Project, most of them will actually tell you that most of our activities had to come to a halt. Like we basically do a lot of awareness and we're visiting students and that kind of thing. And for us, since a virtual situation is almost impossible, it is possible, but just for a selected few. So I found that to be actually another challenge.
And so how would you say, obviously, you've discussed quite a lot about the environmental impact of these challenges. If there's anything more to add to that, and then also sort of how easy it was to cope and deal with the changes, and any new approaches to the situation that you found yourself in, particularly focus on the sort of, as you say, the environmental challenges that you faced.
Coping hasn't exactly been easy. On a national scale, the ecotourism industry has been heavily affected because generally, as a nation, Malawi gets a lot of its revenue from ecotourism and that kind of stuff. So coping has not really been easy because we no longer have people traveling like they usually do. For the startup, the coping mechanism was basically just going back to the drawing board. And I think that also applies to me personally, because now we have like a lot of time, and what do we do generally? So for the startup, we've had to diversify. We had to come up with new products, like one of them being a plantable notepad. It took us some time, but yeah, we actually managed to do it. But for us, it was more of preparing for the next phase, like life after the lockdown and everything.
And I suppose that brings it to life after lockdown. Was there opportunities that arose through that period of lockdown for you? Personally,
yes. I think firstly, I have enjoyed the rest that I got. Like, I have never really had as much time. So apart from everything else that I do, I'm quite interested in climate research. So the opportunity for me was, now I have all of this time going on, and it's been quite easy for me to go into like research and things like those, and also skill development. And also, as my role as a leader, what that meant was I still had to focus generally in the bigger picture, like the leadership development. I found myself enrolled with the John C. Maxwell team for a couple of programs. For me, that was actually very big because it has actually quite helped shape my my thinking and my work generally as a climate change leader. I think that's generally that should be it.
Great, yeah. Some good opportunities in there for sure. And I suppose sort of the final question, what change in your day-to-day life will you take forward past lockdown to help society try and tackle an intersectional approach to a green recovery?
I think probably for me, it would be, I know Alex quite spoke in depth about that. For me, maybe having to slow down and then, okay, since we can't really travel as much and things like those, it actually made me begin to question, like, most of the things that I do, are they actually really necessary? Like, most of the traveling that I do is not really quite as necessary, but really what I think I have never really been quite aware in that sense of the impact of some of my personal activities on my carbon footprint. So I think basically for me, I would really appreciate if I would really focus on like cutting down my travel time and things like those. I think for us, one of the major things that we've learned is the importance of virtual meetings. Like, prior to COVID, I had never really done like a proper a virtual meeting. Like, for me, learning about Zoom and Google Meets and all that stuff, it was kind of new. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that I would love to take forward, even after the COVID lockdown and everything.
No, of course, I think everybody knows the suffering of Zoom fatigue after a wee bit too long on. I don't know how many Zoom quizzes I ended up doing over the period of time. So yeah, no, definitely. Well, thank you so much for being here. And just, is there any sort of final thoughts before we move on to our speaker? We'll obviously come back in the question and answer section, but is there any sort of final thoughts that you wanted to say?
I don't think I have much to say for now. So, sorry for that. yeah, I don't think I actually have much to say for now. So I think I'll go on and maybe I'll give a few more comments in the question and answer section.
Of course. Well, thank you so much. I'm giving a massive applause for everybody here. Thank you so, so much. And on to our last speaker of the evening, Jonathan. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Well, thank you again for being here. I suppose let's just kick it off with, can you tell us a wee bit about yourself and where you were in your life when lockdown started?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, just to start, thank you so much for both of the other talks. It's really good just to hear how honest and people have been sharing, and to hear that people have had the same feelings as me. That's just been really useful for me already. So thank you. So yeah, at the beginning of lockdown, I guess I was in kind of an interesting place. I just finished my PhD at Strathclyde University at the end of 2019, and I had started a new job about a month before we went into lockdown. And so that job was working with still at Strathclyde University, and 50% splitting my time between the university and the Scottish government, working in the Department on Energy and Climate Change within Scottish government. So that was already a big, interesting change for me. And I think it's been fascinating to see the perspective of how different institutions and systems have responded to climate change. So I will talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of my personal situation, I live in Glasgow in a big, drafty shared flat, which is also something that I may touch on later. Yeah, renting in a shared flat. And at the beginning of lockdown, yeah, I guess initially, just like other people have mentioned, there was an element of relief that happened, or well, disbelief to start with, followed by relief. I remember it's about a week before lockdown, it was the Glasgow Comedy Festival, and I went to see a gig in a tiny basement somewhere under Blackfriars pub in Glasgow. And the person, it was Alice Fraser, the Bugle co-host, who was performing, and she made a joke about how we probably all knew that we shouldn't be there, and the sort of nervous looks of everybody in this tiny room about a week before lockdown. But at that point, you know, it was maybe going to be a few weeks at most. It still wasn't something that I really, to be totally honest, took maybe as seriously as you should have done until things became more serious, I suppose. But yeah, the first month of, well, the last few months of doing my PhD, followed by the first month of working in Scottish government, I was traveling all over Scotland to conferences, to meetings and things like that. And yeah, again, the opportunity to step back a little bit and take some rest and reprioritize was initially, at least, a very helpful thing to do. I suppose, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and was there any sort of initial thoughts or fears that you had around the lockdown, and was there anything in your life that was going to dramatically change?
Yeah, so first thing is, I guess, yeah, the challenges of shifting working patterns. Pretty much everyone who I was directly working with in sort of my professional side of things had kids in some ways. So there was a very quick shift in my working patterns that I found that even though I'm, yeah, I guess lucky enough in this setting to not have caring responsibilities, that I still had to completely change the way that I responded to work in order to fit and facilitate the responsibilities that other people that I worked with had. In terms of fears, yeah, I suppose the whole idea of a big system change like this, to some extent, was kind of exciting a little bit. This is like my, again, the sort of slightly guilty side of things, that seeing such a massive societal change happen, whilst obviously being terrifying, whilst obviously being a cause of massive tragedy, is also really interesting from some respects as well. I didn't expect that things would have the level of impact that they've had, the level of, yeah, loss of life, the level of uncertainty. And so, yeah, fairly quickly transitioned from, oh, this is lovely, I'm speaking to people I don't know, doing all the Zoom quizzes, into, yeah, very different feelings as lockdown continued.
No, entirely. I echo that 100%. It's that kind of guilty feeling of, oh, we're alive in one of the most interesting periods of history. And then you think, oh, it couples with quite a lot of other things. I suppose moving on to what would you say were the main challenges that arose over the period of lockdown for you, personal, work or environmental?
Sure. So from the personal perspective, for the first 3 months from March through till the middle of July, the tenement flat below me was being completely renovated, which meant building works every single day. So generally they'd start at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, be going on until 7 o'clock. They were just skirting around the guidelines. Obviously things need to continue to some extent, but the shift in the valuing my sense of place and my flat, and how it felt just horrible for those 3 months to have this feeling of being completely unable to escape from the noise, from like dust that it was causing from other things like that. I'm lucky to live in a really nice flat in a lovely area, really privileged, but at the same time, makes me appreciate how important it is to ensure that people have a safe, peaceful place, more than I ever have in my life before. So that was a big challenge and an incredible relief when sort of lockdown loosening over the summer happened at a similar time to those building works being finished. So it was just important to take as much time as I possibly could during the middle of the day to walk and do things outside and take advantage of being close to parks and green spaces and things like that. There have been massive delays from the sort of environmental side of things. So in Scotland, their new climate change plan should have been published this summer. That's been delayed all the way back to some point next year. Obviously, in Glasgow here, the COP26, the large climate change conference, should have been happening next week. And that was something professionally that I was fairly involved with through the university, organising events and sort of university's response to that. So that's definitely been a big impact that, again, people have been forced to rethink what those events, what that approach looks like. I suppose the other thing that's slightly depressing maybe on the COP26 side of things is that 2020 is the year when, under the Paris Agreement, all countries have to submit their new nationally determined contributions, which are their new individual targets. So not having a big conference happening when those targets should have been submitted that has the eyes of the world on it will maybe lead to some less significant commitments from countries. Obviously, there's the professional shift. And as I mentioned, moving to Scottish Government was already very interesting because they're a really flexible workplace already, very at home with some amount of home working, flexible hours and things like that. But it was a massive change to adapt to exactly how you did that. Being able to work from home. So that's, I guess, then moving into the winter now. The other thing that I found that is super important is I've been thinking a lot about the importance of people's homes as sort of part of, as it relates to climate change, partly because I'm sitting with a hot water bottle shivering every day, but because we're going to be asking huge behavior change from everyone across society moving forwards. And that will be as a knock-on consequence of COVID, but also of climate change and other things like that. And I think, this has really made me reflect on what I value and what I want in my life and what other people, might want as well in that sense.
Of course, no, 100%. And I suppose just combining, because you spoke a lot about the environmental challenges within that, was there anything you wish to add to the environmental impacts of those challenges, or even how easy it was to cope and deal with the changes and challenges, and what new approaches you adopted to each situation that you found yourself in?
Yeah, definitely. So the other thing, another sort of, guilty confession is that I think in the first couple of months, I probably went a bit mad ordering things online. The sort of, I'll just treat myself. I'll buy, a nice bowl. I'll buy these books. I'll buy this board game that needs 6 people that I'm not going to be able to play for another year because I can't see people face to face. And so firstly, that shifted me trying to buy things more locally, trying to, if I'm going to do things like that, finding more ethical ways to direct that consumption. And secondly, just thinking about objects and things that I own. I guess the other side of things, the environmental impact, we're starting to see some of the actual numbers for that, which is kind of interesting. So in 2018, transport was 24% of the demand in Scotland, and that more than halved in, of total energy demand, that more than halved the amount of energy that was used for transport during the sort of second quarter of this year, which I think is, super interesting to see, definitely, those direct impacts.
So I suppose, well, I mean, I can definitely echo the shopping online. I managed to buy myself a whole new work wardrobe, convincing myself that I was be back in the office by July. It's gathering a lot of dust in my cupboard at the moment. I suppose moving on to opportunities then, so what opportunities arose for you through the period of lockdown?
Yeah, so the first opportunity was from the professional side of things, that I've been really lucky to see both how Scottish Government have responded and the shifts in priorities to understand how policy making around thoughts like the idea of the green recovery and responses to COVID have developed. And then similarly on the university side of things, being involved in teaching and trying to understand the shift to online teaching, supporting students and people through that side of things. And I think seeing both of those perspectives has been, really fascinating from my perspective. I think another opportunity that I've definitely had is not having face-to-face meetings with people is a big downside, but also dropping a half an hour meeting into somebody's diary when they've got time to have a chat is often less of an imposition than traveling halfway across the country to go and meet them. So I've definitely taken advantage of that to actually potentially have better access to a lot of people who I've been wanting to work with and communicate with and collaborate with. So yes, whilst obviously there are big downsides from the working side of things, I've also found really useful to build those relationships. I've actually started building in sort of half-hour catch-ups over coffee breaks with people that I work with who I used to see regularly, who, again, it's those happenstance conversations, those bumping into someone at work or on the street that you miss out on. And so that's been sad to miss that. But changing the way that I sort of socialize and building those things into actually like my working day and the way that I do things, it's been really useful from that perspective. That was a big opportunity. I think the other big opportunity is just showing that big changes can happen when there are big problems. And I know this has been mentioned, I'm sure, a lot in this context, but if you look at which countries have had the most successful responses to COVID, the massive problem, the things that they have in common is strong leadership and messaging on the scale of the problem that come from a centralized perspective that enables people to make good decisions. They don't put the emphasis on each individual, although individuals have responsibility within that. And I think there's often this stress in climate change circles that if you ever fly in an airplane or eat a piece of meat, that you are sort of not good enough. And while individual change is required, there needs to be an enabling system to support that as well. And I think, that's been interesting.
100%, couldn't agree more. And I suppose the final question, what change in your day-to-day life will you take forward past lockdown to help society take an intersectional approach to green recovery?
Yeah, sure. I suppose the intersectional part of that question is really interesting. And my reflection, I guess, would be that the impact of lockdown have affected people in different ways, but broadly speaking, people with more affluent people with access to a back garden, to a car, to be able to access green spaces, with the financial flexibility and safety net to be able to not be as concerned about furlough schemes and things like that, have been less massively impacted. So if we want to think about the intersectional context of this, we need to make sure moving forwards that system changes that are going to happen with regards to climate change don't follow that same pattern, and also that we use this as a sort of canary in the coal mine, I guess, because those changes that we're talking about with regards to climate change are not going to happen in 3 months and be as obvious and sudden. They're going to be changes that are going to evolve over the next 30 years within society. And when things are happening at the different pace, it's very easy to not see those changes coming. So that would be, yeah, that's a very fluffy answer, I suppose. But the idea that, yeah, that we've seen that massive system changes disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people really, really clearly. And we need to take, you know, as if we didn't know that already, but an undisputable evidence of this in practice that hopefully will help change people's perspectives on, yeah, things moving forwards.
100%. And so obviously we'll come back in the question and answer session, but is there any sort of final comments before we move on to that?
I don't think so, no.
Great, no worries. Well, thank you so much. Honestly, it's just really refreshing to hear, and I'm applauding massively over here. And we'll hear again from you in just a wee second in the question and answer session. So I think everybody can say that it was a very, very interesting set of answers and questions, and I can't wait to hear what comes up in the question and answer session. But before we move on to the Q&A session, I just want to say a massive thank you to our speakers tonight. You know, if we were in person, the round of applause would be incredibly loud, but unfortunately we'll have to use our imagination for that at the moment. So yeah, just a big thank you. So on to our question and answer section now, which is will be run by our very own Naomi. Are you there, Naomi?
Hello, I'm here. Hello. Hi everyone. I've got my camera off because it was slowing down my speech earlier, but can you hear me okay, Jen? Yeah, awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Jen, for leading us through those talks, and to Alex, Jonathan, and Joanne for sharing your experiences with us, especially as some of them were so personal. So as Jen highlighted earlier, if anyone has a question on this call, please feel welcome to write it into the chat box. And if you write the word ask in capital letters at the start of your question, then we'll recognize that that means that you're happy to ask the question yourself, and we can unmute you and you can ask it. If you are not feeling quite so confident this evening, then do feel welcome to put your question in the chat box and somebody can ask it on your behalf. I've been keeping an eye on this, and I don't think there are any questions in the chat box at the moment. I think you've all been listening very intently, but there's some really interesting conversations around kind of nature connection especially, so thanks Kevin for that point, and also waste management, and how I think we're all recognizing the impact that disposable PPE is having on our communities already. So I guess I wonder if we can kind of start off the discussion and open the floor to whoever wants to speak first in regard to, and maybe I'm being a little bit biased, I have a particularly interested or personal interest in nature connection and how that impacts our climate, our perspective on climate change. But if we are looking at governments, local and national, to recognize that this is something that is deemed important in regard to climate action, how do we as young people support that and kind of encourage that within our communities? How do we play a role in that and lead our communities in a positive direction to increase, expand access to green space? Does anyone have anything they'd like to offer in that?
I'd be happy to jump in with a kind of more of an observation around the importance of the connection, and someone like Jonathan might be better placed on the kind of sort of more systemic interventions that might come with that. But I think there's something that stands out to me around, as I mentioned in sort of my ending comments, around the response of people en masse when required around a critical need. And I think that critical need was protecting themselves and the people that they care about. I think there's so much that has happened for me around that I've seen in friends and family and in myself around connection to nature and connection to outdoor spaces and the importance of outdoor spaces. And it's almost been that once it was taken away, once someone told you you were only allowed to leave your house for an hour a day or 2 hours a day, that choice being taken away from you almost made you appreciate a little bit more. Be really interested to know how many people went out for a walk every single day of full lockdown and then perhaps haven't gone out for a walk every single day since. And so there's been something about that being taken away to actually help you to appreciate it, which is a very extreme situation. But there's also that element of wanting to save something that you care about. And I think people's increased connection to nature, I totally agree with what you said, Naomi. I think that has been important in developing people's understanding of how important the environment is and why they might want to more closely support the climate change agenda. I've also seen from an economic perspective, and this is slightly different, but from an economic perspective, shopping locally has never been more prominent in terms of a lot of groups that I'm part of and a lot of discussions that I've been part of. And that has a sustainable impact as well in terms of environmental impact, in terms of that kind of local reach and sustaining the local economy, but also encouraging people, not to go fast fashion and all the other kind of negative things that come with chain buying. So I think within all of that, people do seem to have better connections, and I think that might be an opportunity to leverage that for our collective agenda around climate change. But I'll be really interested to know and understand whether that continues or whether we go back to business as usual in the next few months. So that's more of an observation from me than a specific tangible action.
I wonder, Joanne, is it, I realised I made an assumption, I think, we quite often, I think, during the lockdown experiences in Scotland were saying that being outside and being in nature is really important. For mental and physical health. Did you see a similar pattern of behaviour persistence in Malawi?
Yes, I actually saw the same thing because I saw a lot of people working from home, and then all of a sudden there was now this interest to go jogging and stuff for just nature walks and that kind of thing. I saw a lot of people do that. So I think it was also the same on this end.
Thank you, Joanne. I think we missed you right at the end, but yeah, I think it sounds like there was some pretty similar experiences, which is really helpful. Jonathan, if I may ask a question to you, because I think you made a comment about how going into the second lockdown and noticing how drafty and cold your home is. How do we keep that energy up even when we are really cold and it's dark outside, and kind of how do we keep our motivation for climate action going over this next lockdown?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think obviously, as was mentioned in the chat, we all have mentioned feeling some element of, the slowdown is both a relief but also makes you feel like you're not doing enough. So that's the first thing, is just to know that everybody feels that way to start with. Over lockdown, I think trying to find activities that you can do that can fit around other things that you're doing and that can be done during the winter is really valuable. So a project that I've had the privilege to be involved in a little bit over lockdown that a few of my friends have been running is involved around the Black Lives Matter movement and has focused on editing Wikipedia pages to add additional information and clarity for Wikipedia pages that are relevant to topics that are pertinent to that area. So that's been really useful for me, firstly, as a way to research and learn, but secondly, as a small thing, the majority of the edits that I've made were adding clarity or adding extra references or informational sources. So it's a really small thing, but Wikipedia is the way that most people or a lot of people interact with knowledge and information. So finding things like that, finding groups and smaller actions that you can do and focusing on the sort of maybe the community side of being active and keeping your energy up would be, I would say, is really important.
Yeah, thank you. Do either of the other speakers want to comment on that, or will we move on to the next question?
think just briefly for me, I noticed there was a question around, you know, kind of keeping your motivation up over the winter months. I think a lot of that is about getting out in the fresh air during the day. Hopefully you have an employer who supports that. We were very lucky to have a team meeting this week where our managers directly sort of suggested that we amend our working days to make sure that we're getting daylight and sunshine, and I think that that's really important. But also just actually hoping to spend more time reading and understanding more about the you know, what we can do, what the current state of play is within the environmental sector. Sometimes I feel very underread. So that's a commitment that I've made in order to stay motivated, stay up to date with news, with reading. 2050, I've got a bit of a climate book club on the go. If anyone's interested in that, that's possibly a good motivator as well. And yeah, just kind of echo some of what Jonathan said as well. And keep that community going, talk to people who are like-minded. The 2050 network's been incredible from that perspective for me to be engaged with this discussion and debate. So yeah, talk to like-minded people and people that care about the same things that you care about, and hopefully that really helps.
Great, thank you, Alex. And I can't move on just yet because I'm trying to rack my brains. I was in Malawi last year and I was there in February and it was really hot. Is it really hot at the moment, Joanne? Are you heading into the kind of warm? We're all talking about kind of getting out our big jumpers and scarves, but maybe you guys are getting ready for some warmer, wetter weather. I think, is that correct at this time of year?
Actually, this is like one of the hottest months of the year. So I actually can't relate to it being cold. Of course, I was in Scotland last year in November.
Yeah.
So I think I can relate from that perspective. But really, on this end, the temperatures are about maybe 35, 36 degrees Celsius. So which is actually on the higher end.
Yeah. So not hiding away too much. But and how is COVID looking for you guys? Obviously, we've talked about heading into a second lockdown. Are you heading into another one, or is yours continuing? Where are you at this time?
Actually, the COVID situation in Malawi has actually been so much better over the past 2 months. Like today, there was no COVID case reported, and the numbers have been maybe one, the most being somewhere around 7 per day. Yeah. So for Malawi, we're basically going back to the normal mode. We're just basically accepting that, well, COVID is here and we're learning how to live with it with all the other measures in place. But the COVID situation here in Malawi is actually quite normalized. We don't really have a lot of cases. There haven't been deaths in a very long time.
Yeah, that's really good news. Hopefully we'll get there soon. I think Joe had a question on the chat. Maybe, do you want to ask that, Joe? Thanks, guys.
Naomi.
Hello.
Yeah, I just found it really interesting, and it's obviously something that's touched on me. The reason I asked for it, but was that you all, when you were mentioning your own experience, you all mentioned this guilt when suddenly life slowed down, suddenly society slowed down, you had less pressure, and you were suddenly like, oh, I've got little to do now. The pace of life has suddenly stopped, and it's obviously sort of affected you kind of negatively in the sense that, you had this guilt and it was maybe, providing a bit of a less value. You kind of viewed yourself through your productivity almost. I don't mean to describe you as that, but potentially that's how it felt. And that's definitely how I feel sometimes. And as mentioned on the question, you feel like this is kind of a society-wide thing that's encouraged in our behaviour, or do you feel you're naturally more of a busy people and like to be active a lot and all the time? So yeah, just be great to hear your own reflections on that take. On you go, Joanne, or Alex, or Jonathan.
We're all being very polite and nobody wants to jump in over the top of each other.
I should maybe chairs for that. Alex, you go.
Thank you. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that, and I think it's a really interesting element of where we're at. I do believe that we are driven to be productive / overproductive in society. I think there's an awful lot of evidence on stuff and emphasis on stuff and things, and buying stuff and striving to be everywhere and do everything. And social media does not help with that, in my opinion. I think this drive to kind of be everywhere, do everything, travel, the kind of the artificial element of social media, and that you only really see the highlights of people's lives, I think puts a huge amount of pressure on people, individuals, young people, old people, whatever. And I've spent a lot of time sitting in my flat thinking, what do I actually need? What do I need to, not so much what do I want, but what do I need? What can I clear out? What can other people benefit from? So I think that sort of whole debate and discussion around stuff and time is a really important one. And the reason I'm reflecting probably quite profoundly on it at the moment is because this week I've had one of the busiest weeks I've had probably since March. Work has been really busy, was preparing really excitedly for this webinar, a few other things going on. And actually what I've realized is I've eaten badly. I haven't eaten sustainably. I haven't eaten locally. I haven't been to the shop that I should have been to get, you know, in terms of the refill shop that's just down the road to normally get ingredients and cook from scratch. And I suddenly thought, you know, you're actually going back to the habits that you had before. And why is that? What's the drive around being busy and not having time? When I look back to a generation ago, and our grandparents and great grandparents were busier than ever with less and did more and achieved more in a more sustainable manner. So I think it is something, I don't know if that's really answering the question, but it's something that's really, really strongly in my mind and I feel quite passionate about. And I think helping people to manage their lives, maybe not helping them to manage their lives better, but I think if people were less busy, they'd be more inclined to pick more sustainable choices. If you've got more time, you've got time to cycle or walk, you don't have to jump in the car. If you perceive that you've got more time, you can go to 2 or 3 local shops to do your shopping, as opposed to going to the supermarket where everything's there and it's all packaged in plastic. There's definitely something in there about the urgency of life and the opportunity to make more sustainable choices. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's really, really important. So thank you for the question.
Does anybody else have a kind of reflection to add on that?
I don't think I can add much other than to say that, yeah, I really feel that as well. I've also been super busy the past couple of weeks in a way that I always sort of told myself, oh, I do best under pressure. That's how I perform. I need the deadlines. I need that pressure. And a lot of my deadlines have been much more flexible because I've been lucky to have good employers who've understood things. And yeah, these past couple of weeks where I've had some pretty rigid deadlines to get sorted, I've actually realized that that was pretty horrible. And not necessary either. Like, yeah, it's just a bunch of things have conspired to make that happen. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's really interesting to hear you discuss guilt, and Joe, thanks for your question on that, because, and I wonder if you guys have had a similar question or conversation with friends that I have, in that I've had friends recognize a sense of guilt in the way that they feel with some of the COVID restrictions. So they've sort of said, I know I shouldn't, I don't know, hug you, but I'm going to. I shouldn't have gone to visit my family. I feel guilty about it, but I decided to do that. And I've had friends say to me that maybe haven't had climate sympathies beforehand, I think I get the climate guilt that you felt before. Like, I know I shouldn't fly, but I'm going to. I know I shouldn't buy this plastic package thing, but I'm going to, and feel guilty about that. Have you, Joanna, or the guys in Scotland, had any of this, like, understanding almost of the guilt that we know we shouldn't do something, but it's just easier and it's more convenient and we're going to do that, and so therefore they're going to do it, which I think has been helpful, at least for me, to open up conversations with friends that maybe haven't been so sympathetic towards climate change previously.
Yeah, that's put into words something that I've definitely been feeling. And then, yeah, I guess the last thing on guilt, the other thing that I've been feeling is I don't have children. I currently don't have building works going on in the flat underneath me. I live really close to a lovely park. I've lived with someone who I get on incredibly well with. I'm really lucky in a lot of senses. And so I feel guilty for feeling bad because I know that there's so many people who've got it worse. And I think it's really important to also say other people having it worse doesn't mean that it's not bad for you. And it's fine to feel down, to feel shit about this situation, because it is bad for everybody. And yeah, other people having bad experience alongside that doesn't make your bad experience invalid.
I think that's such an important point in terms of the mental health aspect of the COVID pandemic, but also being someone who's passionate about climate change and environmental issues. I think, you know, I totally recognise what you said, Jonathan, in terms of my own position, and I kind of referenced it in my original talk around just feeling this sense of real privilege and real luck. But it doesn't mean that I haven't had, you know, really challenging moments over the past while. And I think someone was asking in the chat earlier, you know, how do you stay motivated over the winter months around the climate change agenda? Some of my challenges are around how do I stay motivated ever with the climate change agenda, because sometimes it does feel hopeless. It does feel really, really hard. It feels like people aren't listening. It feels like people aren't doing enough. And actually the resilience that I think that we've needed to develop over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown and everything that's been thrown at us as individuals and collectively, I think that resilience will pay dividends in terms of, you know, our pursuit of climate change, the climate change agenda, and the goals that we want to collectively see achieved, because that resilience is going to be needed. And, you know, at some point, I think in the future, I am going to look back and say, do you know what? This isn't as hard as 2020 was. I can do this. And I hope that other people feel that way. But equally, you know, that's not to diminish the journey that we've all been on to get here. And actually doing this, having this whole process has been so interesting, because it's just been a really profound reflection of where we've been and how far we've all come. And even when you think that you haven't, you really have. And I think we're all going to need that resilience as we move forward with this agenda that we're all so passionate about.
Thanks, Alex. Joanne, do you have anything to add in this kind of topic of guilt from your perspective?
Well, I probably haven't felt guilty in a long time, okay, because like 2 months, about 6 weeks ago, my life had to go back full swing.
Yeah.
So yeah, school came back in and everything else came back in, and I think I've been just so I think my goal recently has just been surviving, you know.
Yeah.
I'm actually very grateful that I didn't lose my source of livelihood. I didn't lose much in that sense. I'm actually very grateful for that. But on the other hand, I probably didn't feel as much guilty, maybe because I have all of this stuff going on. Like life back here in Malawi is back to normal. Like you actually see very few people back to wearing masks and all that. So I think I haven't thought of it in that perspective, and it's just been interesting to hear Joe and Alex explain it from that perspective. I found that quite a bit interesting.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, that is really interesting. You're, probably in quite a different position, it sounds, in Malawi compared to where we are in the UK. No comment on our government around that. So I think we have another person on the call, Gyan, who has a question to ask. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
My question is mainly directed at Jonathan, but it's also like open to everyone. So what I wanted to ask was, like, what's next for academia? Like, is there opportunity for students or researchers in such times of gloom to look for more sustainable solutions, both environmental and economic, to fix the current situation, take inspiration from it, and improve our chances for the future?
So yes, this is the time when we need inventiveness and innovation more than ever. But I think the other thing that's true about this and about climate change is that traditional academia alone isn't enough. There needs to be a recognition of that we live in a massive system of people and humanity, and that people's behavior, people's perceptions of things are vital to that. So I think the opportunities for academia are to move forwards in a more understanding those concepts more. I'm trying to think exactly how to express that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's super important to have new ideas, but also a lot of that needs to be about how we can implement the tools and approaches that we already have. Washing your hands and wearing a mask to combat a pandemic is a technology solution. The challenge has been yeah, driving behavior change around that and pushing that forward, I guess. So yeah, that would be sort of my reflection. It's making sure that when we educate, when we think about academia research about technology, that you think about the people that are using it and ask questions and understand those sides of things as well. Yeah, academia as an early careers researcher is a bit rubbish as well, because so I'm never a full-time employee as an early careers researcher. I basically get a year's funding and then have to sort of reapply and justify myself every year until I get sort of a tenured position. So I've just gone through that process of justifying my existence to the people who pay my salary so that they can carry on paying my salary, which is something that obviously people do in their jobs in general, but having such a formal process of, yes, until a week ago, I wasn't being paid after the end of December yeah. So I would say that's a good example of how the system of academia and the way it rewards people should probably be rethought as well in uncertain times. But yeah.
As someone who's graduated from university fairly recently, I understand what you're trying to convey, and I think it's quite amazing what you're doing. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks again. So that was going to be our last question. If anyone has any burning questions that I've missed either in the chat or there's something come into your head, please put that in there. Next 5 seconds whilst I read out a comment from somebody that's on the call, Andrew, who is saying that there's so much positivity in the fact that I think there's over 40 people on this call this evening, and we know that around the world there are so many people like ourselves working really hard to kind of build community and build a movement really around fighting for a better situation in regards to our climate and our communities that we live in and depend on so strongly. So thank you to everybody that is on this call, and thank you especially to Alex, Jonathan and Joanne sharing their experiences and making sure that we stay motivated and remember that we have this amazing community around us locally, but also kind of around the world, and we have an amazing network of individuals in both Scotland and Malawi that we can use in regard as kind of motivation and practical resources. So we should lean on that over the next few months and thereafter. So please hold on to that as really positive thoughts, and thank you, Andrew, for putting that in the chat. I think that's a really valid and really important point, that while sometimes it does feel difficult, I think was it Jonathan kind of said, like, sometimes it feels really hopeless, but actually there are really hopeful things going on in it, and we do well to remember that. So thank you. I can't see any last minute questions whilst I've been rambling, so I will pass back to Jen now, I think, who will end this discussion.
Of course, thank you so much, Naomi. That was, oh man, just, I think we hit the nail on the head with the empowering tactic from 2050. So thank you so much for everybody's questions, and it's incredibly thought-provoking. Yeah, thank goodness it's all recorded, so I can go back and properly listen and not have my 2050 brain working. So just a wee final thing before we go, before I let you off to your evenings. I wanted to just say that we are currently recruiting. So if Georges, you could share the slide. So yeah, we are currently recruiting for volunteers. So we are really fun, and we would absolutely love for you guys to join us, and we can do all of these things much more. And basically, yeah, if you want to join us, there's a QR code on the screen, or there is that's for the survey. Wrong point. If you want to join us, all of the information is under the opportunities part on our website, and we'll also be sending out a wee follow-up email which will have details in it too as well. The deadline for this is the 16th of November. So if you're wanting to come and work with us, then please submit your applications then, that would be great. And also, yes, now onto the QR code. This is for giving us feedback for the event. If you could please fill this in when you have the time, it lets us know kind of what you want from events and what future events we could be running, and your input is always super valued. So if you can do that, that would be really good. Also, it's just come around in the chat as well there. And I just also want to say a big thank you to all of our sponsors. They make it possible for 2050 to be able to continue with these events and our future events. So thank you so much to them. And yeah, a big thank you to everybody for being here tonight as well. I know that it's quite draining to be on Zoom sometimes and not have that interaction with other people, but I really hope that everyone had a fruitful conversation, and yeah, I will let you go on to your evenings now.